Star Walker Studios presents Game Master's Journey, your multi-dimensional RPG podcast. Welcome to the third episode in my GM 101 series in which I answer the question, how do I become a game master? Today, I set off again on the Obsidian Monolith to respond to your feedback and do my best to answer your questions about game mastering. So join me on the journey. Together, we can become game masters truly worthy of the title. Hello, listener. Greetings, fellow GM and or player. Welcome to episode 71 of Game Master's Journey, your multi-dimensional RPG podcast. I'm your host, Lex Starwalker, and I'm transmitting to you today from the Obsidian Monolith somewhere outside time and space. So in the last GM 101 episode 70, I didn't get through all the feedback, and so I thought I'd just go ahead and do another GM 101 for episode 71. Why the hell not? But before I get into that, I want to send a shout out and thank you to my Tier 5 patron, Steve Strickland. Let's hear it for Steve! Woo! All right. So if you want to check out the first two GM 101 episodes, check out episode 68 and episode 70. And I'll have those linked in this episode at starwalkerstudios.com/Game Master's Journey. All right. So my first comment/question today comes from Steve Ela, and I'm going to say his name right this time. And Steve says, "Hi Lex, just started listening to your latest episode and already have a few questions." Awesome. Questions are good. So his question, or his first question, regards pacing, this is a big topic. I could do a whole episode just on pacing. He says, "One of my biggest issues is not controlling the pacing enough. When I watch a movie or TV show, pacing is one of the things that will keep me interested." Yeah, absolutely. I can wait for the plot to develop, but if the pacing isn't right, I lose interest. That can happen at the GM table as well. Have you found any tricks for keeping the pacing active and engaging without pushing the players too fast? So yes, there are a few tricks that I know of for this. The first one, and this is probably one of the biggest ones, is something that will oftentimes kill your pacing and bring your game to a screeching halt is rules discussions. Okay, so I usually, when I run a game, I just have, one of my table rules is I don't want to have discussions of the rules during the game. If people have questions about the rules or they want to discuss the rules, then I encourage them to bring that up before we start. And I will usually, at the beginning of a session, say, does anyone have any questions or anything they want to talk about before we get started? Or they can talk about it after we wrap up, or we can talk about it in between sessions. So, if you're playing online, you can talk about it by email or on a Google Plus community or on a forum, or, however you're congregating online, you should have some ways that you can have conversations outside of the gaming session. If you're gaming with people physically, you can call each other on the phone, text message, email, get together for coffee or a beer or whatever. For me, I've found that that's the number one thing that will kill pacing in your game is, something comes up rules wise and you're going to sit there and have a discussion about the rules. Not only does it kill the pacing, but it kicks everybody out of the story. It kicks everybody out of character. It just really destroys everything that you're probably trying to do as a game master during the session. And, this takes some practice and some discipline on both the player's part and your part as a GM, because you have to be willing to just make a ruling on the fly and not feel like you have to look everything up, right? And especially when you're a new GM, you know, that can be hard, but at the same time, that's when it's most important. Because, I mean, let's face it, unless you have like a photographic memory, as a new GM, if you're going to stop the game every time you want to look up, or every time something comes up that you're not sure about and you want to look it up, you're never going to get anywhere. You're going to be stopping the game every few minutes to look stuff up, and your players are going to be bored to tears. So you're better off just making a ruling on the fly that makes sense. And you can even say, you know what, I'm not sure the exact rule on this. I don't want to take the time to look it up right now. So this is what we're going to do right now. And in between this session and the next session, I will look up the rule and I will let you know, if in the future I'm going to do it differently because maybe, the rule's different than the way I did it, or I think about it more and I come up with a better way to do it. So that would be my first piece of advice, is do not allow discussions of the rules while you're actually gaming. Before the session, after the session, or during a break, if you take a break, those are times to discuss the rules, or in between sessions, not during the session. And especially not in a dramatic moment, right? Like one of my pet peeves and kind of a further point on that rule that I try to enforce is, whatever game we're playing, once we roll initiative for combat or any kind of scene where we're going to be in initiative, like, that is not the time. That is definitely not the time to discuss rules, because in a lot of games, or well, really every game I've ever played, combat takes longer than anything else. As soon as you get into turn orders and initiative, the game just by necessity slows down. The pacing slows down. So you don't want to be doing anything above and beyond what you have to that's going to slow it down even more, right? And rules discussions, they just kill your pacing. So, just be comfortable with making rulings on the fly and just let your players know, this may not be the way it is in the book. I'm not going to take time to look it up right now. This is the way I'm doing it, and we're going on. And also, I don't want you to take the time to look it up right now, because sometimes what'll happen is you'll make a ruling on the fly, and like, let's say you're in combat, you make a ruling on the fly because you want to keep things going, and you're going through players' turns, and then some player pipes up because they were looking up the rule, and now they want to tell you what the rule is, which again is going to kill your pacing, and that player wasn't paying attention to what was going on while they were looking that rule up, right? So I'm not a fan of that either. So you might also want to be clear, like, this is the way we're doing it for this session. So don't look it up now because this is the way we're doing it. I'm not going to change my mind in the middle of the session. Another thing that you can do to help with pacing is to always have a few things in your back pocket for any time things start to slow down. And this is a time-honored technique that comes straight from Dungeons and Dragons. This is, when I was first exposed to it anyway, and it's a very common thing in Dungeons and Dragons. It's a great time to do a random encounter, right? Anytime things are starting to go off track, or maybe the players are just over planning something and they're going in circles, or you just feel like things are starting to drag. One great way to get things going is to just spring a random encounter, or spring an encounter that you've planned ahead of time. I could do a whole episode on random encounters because they get kind of a bad rap, probably because different GMs do random encounters differently. When you say random encounter, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're rolling a random result on a random table and you're just taking whatever it is and it's completely random and you didn't know what it was ahead of time. That's not what a random encounter has to be. It just means that it's not an encounter that's part of your plot. It's just an encounter to represent that sometimes things have happened that have nothing to do with whatever you're trying to accomplish. Like, that's how the world works, right? And it brings some verisimilitude to the game. It brings some variety to the game. Myself, I vary how I do random encounters, depending on the adventure or the game or my mood at the time. Sometimes I will make an actual table with encounters, and I will either during the session roll and just see what comes up, or a lot of times what I'll do, even if I'm using a table, is I'll roll before the session so that I know if or when there is a random encounter, I already know what that encounter is going to be, and I can already have thought about like how that's going to work. Another way that I tend to do it, and I do this more than making a table, is I just come up with some encounters that I can kind of put anywhere. And I talked about this a little bit when I did my couple episodes where I was preparing a D&D adventure. And like I came up with an encounter with some sturges, and I was like, this is something that can happen anywhere, anytime. Because they're these little flying creatures. They could easily be in the trees or something and you don't notice them. And, anytime things are starting to drag, or I feel like, we need a little excitement, I can just have sturges show up out of nowhere, right? Also, these kinds of things, they don't have to be a combat encounter. So if you're in like a city or somewhere else where there's NPCs all over the place, and things start to drag, you start to lose your pacing, you can have NPC encounters or interactions in your back pocket as well. So, the classic way this is done a lot of times is, let's say you're doing the classic, it's the first adventure, the PCs are in a bar hanging out, and you're kind of giving them the chance to role play, introduce their characters, discuss their backgrounds or whatever, because you want to let them do that if they want to do that. In some groups, you can start out in a bar first session and they'll role play for an hour. Easy, and it's a lot of fun and everybody's having a great time. And if that's what's happening, then let it ride, right? But then some groups, they'll just stare at you waiting for something to happen, right? Or somewhere in between. So usually what you do is you have an idea of something to pull them out of that bar and get the adventure going, right? So maybe they're in the bar and you decide, like, let's say your first adventure is going to be a murder mystery. You want the PCs to have the opportunity to investigate a murder. So you can have a scene planned where they're shouting from outside the bar and screams and whatnot. And then when the PCs go to investigate, there's a murder. Well, there's been a murder, but there's a body in the street in front of the bar, right? So you can wait for when the pacing is starting to drop to spring that and have that happen. Or even better, if you can kind of anticipate and do it a little bit before the pacing starts to drop, like that's the ideal. But that takes a little bit of foresight on your part as a GM. So yeah, no matter where the PCs are, no matter what they're doing, when you go into any session, I would always recommend having, one or two or a few encounters or NPCs or events that can happen kind of anytime you need it to happen, and use those when you see the pacing start to drop or right before you think it's going to drop. The PCs are just talking endlessly about what they're going to do next and not really getting anywhere, or you're getting bored with it, or nobody's really saying or doing anything, or whatever. Another thing that can really kill your pacing, believe it or not, it might seem a little counterintuitive, is a really long combat. Because I just mentioned how, just by the way these games work, combat takes longer than non-combat, right? Usually if you're having to make rolls in a non-combat situation, you make one or two or a few rolls and that's it. Where in a combat, you're making roll after roll after roll and everybody's taking turns, and it slows down. Even the lightest system still slows down during combat. And I found that there's definitely kind of a sweet spot when it comes to how long a combat lasts. And if you pay attention, you'll notice when your PCs are starting to get bored with a combat. You'll notice when you're starting to get bored with a combat. And when you see that happening, whoever's bored, whether it's you or the PCs, if anybody's getting bored with the combat, wrap it up. If you as a GM can tell which way it's going, like it's obvious the PCs are going to win or it's obvious the PCs are going to lose, then just have that happen. Just narrate it. If it's not obvious, resolve the rest of the combat with just a couple rolls, or maybe like one roll for each PC or something like that. And then based on that roll, decide how to resolve the combat. But don't feel like you're committed to this long slog of a combat if people aren't having fun with it. Move on with the story. Another area where pacing can lag is just when you're not prepared for the session as a GM. So this could be just because you just didn't prepare enough and you're just not ready, period. And so you're umming and ahhing while you're trying to figure out what's going to happen next, or you're flipping through books because you didn't acquaint yourself with things that you need to know beforehand, whether that's rules or setting information or whatever. Or it could happen because you were prepared, or at least you thought you were, but the PCs do something or go somewhere that you didn't expect, and now you're not sure what to do, right? So, that can be a little more difficult to do with or to deal with. But one thing that I think can work is if you're in a situation where you're kind of not sure what to do next, and I kind of talked about this last episode, and you're not sure what to do, instead of kind of fumbling around and letting the pacing kind of falter, I think you're better off just taking a break and saying, hey, let's take 5. Because then it's like a commercial break of a TV show, right? You can have a really tense moment in a TV show, cut to commercial break, and it's almost like this little cliffhanger, come back and be right in that moment again. And the pacing doesn't really suffer as much as if in the middle of that scene, like things just completely slowed down and got boring for a while, right? So I think that works with an RPG too. So, take a break if you need to and figure out what you're going to do next, or just, take a brain break, let your mind rest for a minute. It's amazing. Like sometimes I found, I usually don't think to take a break when I really need one, like to prepare something or whatever. But I usually just in my sessions try to take a break like somewhere near the middle, just because people have to use the bathroom and whatnot. And I've found that just taking that 5 or 10 minutes and just not thinking about the game for a minute, or at least not having to be in the GM seat for a minute. Well, I don't sit, but you know what I mean. That when I come back from that break, I'm kind of refreshed a little bit just by letting my mind kind of disengage from being a GM for a few minutes. And, as far as the last part of Steve's question here, where he says, any tricks for keeping the pacing active and engaging without pushing the players too fast? I don't think you can push the players too fast. I don't think that's even a thing. Don't worry about pushing your players too fast. If that's even possible, which I really don't think it is, you're much more likely to not push them fast enough and to let things drag than you are to actually push them too fast, which I don't even think is a thing. Like, there's no such thing as pushing the players too fast. That is a great way to build suspense and urgency, to keep a really quick pace. Like if you're trying to run a game and you want more of kind of like that thriller feel, or more of like a action movie feel, a great way to do that is to keep the pacing up and not let your players have long discussions about things or have long periods of time where not much is going on. It's like let's say they make camp, you're like, is there anything important that you want to do during camp? And if they're like, no, then it's the next morning, or it's whenever the first encounter is going to happen that night. Like, if you're wanting a fast-paced game, don't worry about pushing your players too hard or too fast, because, there's really no such thing. And I think a game benefits a lot from the PCs having more things on their plate and more possibilities of what they could do than they have time to deal with, right? It makes them make hard decisions, and it makes it feel like there's more going on around them than just what they're doing. And, one great way to get to that point is to not give them a lot of like in real world time downtime during a session. Like, keep things moving, and anytime nothing's really happening and people aren't really doing anything, or there's not really good RP going on, just keep things moving. So yeah, I wouldn't worry about pushing the players too fast. I don't think it's going to happen. I've never managed it. All right, so next, Steve talks about what he's calling benefit tokens. So things like inspiration in D&D, fate points, stuff like that. He really likes games like D&D 5th edition and Fate that use player-driven content from time to time. When you have that kind of the economy, my issue is making sure that economy is fluid. Most times I forget to compel players to get them the points they need. And of course, that means they're going to hoard the ones they have. Most times I'm focused more on what I'm actually doing as a GM and forget to interact with the characters themselves. So yeah, this is a thing. This is a great point. And I don't know if I have a great answer for this one. Honestly, my answer would be don't worry about it. You know, I did a whole podcast, GM Intrusions, that was pretty much about Numenera, and Numenera has a mechanic like that called the GM Intrusion. And the GM Intrusion is basically where you spring something on the player character, usually some kind of complication or something that's going to make their life more difficult or something bad that's going to happen. And they have the option to accept that, and that becomes true, and then they get some XP, or they pay some XP and it doesn't happen, right? The thing is with that game is the GM Intrusion, at least the way the game is written or designed, is supposed to be one of the major ways that they get XP, which they also use to advance their characters. The thing with that is, you know, when I first started Numenera, like I loved the GM Intrusion, you know, I thought it was great. I had a lot of fun with it. But the problem with it, or my problem with it, is I think something like a GM Intrusion is great, where the GM says, I want this complication to happen, and maybe the players have a chance to accept or reject it, or maybe they don't. Maybe it just happens. I kind of feel like the GM Intrusion is like GMing on training wheels. It's like teaching the GM and the players how things should just be anyway. I mean, if I'm the GM and I want a complication to happen, I shouldn't have to pay you for it to happen. It should just happen because I'm the GM, right? And you know, that's the way it works in D&D. That's the way it's always been. You know, if I want to say some complication happens, it just happens. You don't get a chance to buy that off with XP. So, you know, I kind of feel like it's, you know, training you how it should be. But ideally, you know, that shouldn't be codified in the system. That should just be the way you play the game. And the problem with a game like Numenera with the GM Intrusion, or a game like Fate with the Fate points, where that economy of those Fate points or experience points or whatever they're getting for those intrusions or those compels that you're doing, when that is tied to character advancement, to where it's a thing where you, as a GM, you feel like you have to do that X amount of times a session per player, or they're not getting what they need to play the game. I have a problem with that, because I found that to be restrictive. You know, kind of like what Steve's playing or saying here is, you know, you feel like you have to do it so many times a session or whatever, and if you don't manage it, then you feel like you failed as a GM. And you're worried about, oh, I got to hit my quota of GM intrusions today, or I got to hit my quota of compels today, or we're not playing the game right. And it's such bullshit. You know, if you're having fun, you're playing the game right. And so that's the problem I have with those systems where they tie a mechanic like that into character advancement and development. Because I think it's a flaw. I think that's a flaw in those systems, because it's kind of like this limit you're putting on the game, and especially on the GM, where instead of like doing a compel or a GM intrusion when a really cool one occurs to you and it's just a really great time to do one, you're trying to force it, because you're like, oh, I got to give every player character their 2 GM intrusions this session. I've got 5 characters, so that's 10 GM intrusions I got to do, and you end up doing ones that it's just forced. They're not that great. They don't necessarily fit, or you're stressing out about it, or you're coming up with them ahead of time and all this stuff. And I think those kinds of things work the best and are the most fun when they're done spontaneously on the fly. I feel like if you're in the position where you're planning GM intrusions and compels ahead of time, like, I don't know, you're just going too far with it. So I guess my advice, honestly, would be either play a game where that isn't connected to character advancement, or remove it from character advancement. So I'm not really familiar enough with Fate to suggest how you would do that with Fate, but with like a Cypher system game, just give the characters the XP they need just from the session rewards, and don't worry, just remove the whole, oh, you need so many GM intrusions to have enough XP. And in that way, when it's appropriate and you feel inspired to do a GM intrusion, any XP they get from that is bonus. It's not like something they have to have, right? And actually, the better advice I would give is just remove that from the game entirely. Do the GM intrusions, but just remove the XP part, and remove the whole like, oh, you have a chance to refuse it. Because in the, I don't know, year or 2 years or whatever that I ran Numenera, I think once or twice in all that time, I had a PC actually refuse a GM intrusion. Almost always they accepted because they thought it would be cool. And at that point, it's like, well, if they're accepting pretty much every time I do this, obviously there's no need for a mechanic. There's no need for an XP reward, because the players get it, and they get that I'm a GM helping them to tell a cool story. And if I'm going to introduce a complication, I'm doing it because it's going to be cool, not just to fuck with them, right? And if you have a group that's at that level, you don't need mechanics baked into the system to tell you how to play the game, because you already know how to play the game. So yeah, I don't know how helpful that's going to be to you, Steve, because I don't really have an answer as far as using those systems as they're written. I mean, you can beat yourself up over it, and you can plan GM intrusions and compels ahead of time and try to hit your quota. But honestly, I just feel like that's really dumb. And I feel like you're kind of losing the forest for the trees at that point. And I personally would recommend focusing more on building trust with your players and getting them to realize that, hey, when I introduce a complication, I'm not doing it just to make your life miserable. I'm doing it because it's going to make the story better. And you need to trust me enough as a GM to be okay with that. And I shouldn't have to bribe you, right? I mean, that's kind of like the elementary school way. I have to give you a treat so that you'll do your chores, kind of thing. I shouldn't have to do that. If we're all mature gamers and we're all in this together, I should just be able to say, you get captured. And don't give me the stink eye. This is for the good of the story. You get captured. I don't need to give you XP. I don't need to give you a magic item. I don't need to give you a fate point. It just happens because it's going to be awesome. And, if you don't trust me as a GM, then maybe you shouldn't be playing in my game. I mean, if I didn't trust a GM and I thought he was just out to get my character, I wouldn't play. I'd find something else to do with my time. So I hope that's helpful. I don't know. So thank you, Steve Ela, for those questions, and definitely feel free to follow up with me if you have further questions or whatever. Oh, and I guess before I go to the next thing, he also mentioned that because he's not doing the compels as much as he should, then they're hoarding their fate points, right? Because they're not getting as much of them as they quote unquote should. And, that's just another problem with these kinds of systems. And so, again, I think if you can find a way to just cut the XP or fate point part of that out and just keep the story element that's really what matters, your game's going to be better for it. And then you don't have to worry about it. You can just do it when it's dramatically appropriate, when you have a cool idea and you don't feel like you have to force it all the time. All right. So my next message comes from Sophia Brandt from Google+. And Sophia says, I really love your podcast. It's one of the best out there in terms of quality. Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Sophia. I really appreciate that. That means a lot to me. She says, I'm a new GM myself. I've run around 10 one-shots. Okay. I'd say if you've run 10 one-shots, maybe you're still a new GM, but you're definitely not a beginner. You're getting pretty hardened at that point, I think. So here are some ideas that Sophia has. How do you write down preparation notes so that they are easily available during play? Published adventures often have, quote, running text, so it's difficult to get the most important information at a glance. Yeah, I completely agree. This is one of my pet peeves with published adventures. And honestly, I don't know that I've ever run or bought or read a published adventure that did not have this problem of just giving you way too much, just paragraphs and paragraphs of information that A, you're not going to be able to remember, and B, is way too much to be able to skim and get what you need from during play. So ultimately is pretty much useless. So, how to write your own prep notes, whatever form those takes, so that they're most useful to you. That's a really good question. And, again, I don't know that I have the answer for that. That's something I'm constantly working on myself. So one idea that I think helps a lot with this is actually an idea that I got from the book Never Unprepared, which I talked about in episode 56 of Game Master's Journey. Now, I'll warn you, if you haven't read Never Unprepared, don't freak out when you read it, because the author does way more prep than probably you do or want to do. And that's okay. You don't have to do that massive amount of prep to get use from the book or whatever. But basically, what he suggested that I thought was a really great idea is basically whatever kind of session notes or whatever that you're using for your sessions, assuming that you're not handwriting them, which I feel like in this day and age is the worst possible way to do it. Most of us probably can type at least as fast as we can write. And, it's a lot easier to edit and change things if it's in a Word document than if it's handwritten on a piece of paper. So assuming you're using something electronic like Word or something like that, is make a template that you're going to fill out for each session. And then at the end of the session, or even during the session, while you're using your notes, take note of anything that's missing that needed to be there, or anything that was there that you didn't use and therefore didn't need, or anything that you had a hard time finding, or anything that was kind of out of order, right? So ideally, you have your piece of paper with your notes on it, and you just go in order down the sheet of paper, and everything's there kind of in the order that you need it, so it makes it easier to find. And so make those mental or even, write notes throughout the game or right after the game of anything like that, and then go and adjust the template. And if you do that over time, you're going to end up with a template that works perfectly for you and is organized the way that you need it. And also, as far as things to have in your session notes, try to figure out as a GM what your strengths and weaknesses are. And things that are your strengths, you don't really need to have in your session notes, or at least have very little, because you're going to bang that out. You don't need help with that. When you're making your notes, focus on things that are your weaknesses and things that you think you'll forget, right? So maybe you're really good at describing scenes and setting the stage, so you don't need to write descriptions for the scenes in your session notes because you're really good at that. You can do that on the fly. But maybe you're not so good at NPC characterizations. So maybe in your session notes, for every major NPC that you think might come into play during the session, have a few words written down as far as personality traits and how to role play that character, that kind of thing, or how to describe them even. So yeah, that would be my first piece of advice is try to make a template, and over time, after every session, adjust it and modify it to try to get it in that sweet spot of exactly what you need. The other piece of advice I would give is kind of, notice in these published adventures, what's not working for you, and make sure you're not doing the same thing when you make your own notes. So like Sophia says here, the big problem with published adventures is there's just way too much information, and it's not organized in a way that's easy to reference during a game. Like, putting a bunch of things in a paragraph is the worst possible way to convey information that you're going to need during the game, right? So maybe you have a paragraph and there's 5 pieces of information. Well, every time you want to find one of those 5 pieces of information, you have to scan the entire paragraph to find it, which eats up time and is really frustrating. And it's amazing. Open any published adventures and there's paragraphs everywhere. What the fuck, people? How long have we had RPGs and people haven't figured out how to write published adventures? Anyway, sorry. I guess a lot of that is you're supposed to, as the GM, read that before the session and somehow retain it all, but it's usually really long. Like, a great example of this is Hoard of the Dragon Queen and Rise of Tiamat, the first published adventures for D&D 5th edition. I mean, there's so much information in those books. It's just stupid. You're never going to remember it all. And it's way too much to try to skim during a session. So a better way is bullet points, right? So those 5 pieces of information, instead of having them in this block paragraph where every time you have to go through the whole thing to find the one of the 5 things that you need, have 5 bullet points. And then you can easily remember, I need to look at the 3rd bullet point, or I need to look at the 1st bullet point. And it just separates it out into these little bite-sized pieces. Because the idea is you want something where you can glance at it and you don't even have to read it, like left to right, read the thing. You can just glance and there's 5 words. You can see the 5 words all at once and register what's there. You don't have to actually read it, if you know what I mean. So for instance, if you want to describe an NPC, instead of writing out a paragraph describing the NPC, just put down 3 to 5 words, adjectives, like tall, dark hair, dark eyes, loud, obnoxious, bad hygiene, right? I mean, I could have written those out in a nice paragraph. This character is 6'3" tall, has dark brown hair and dark brown eyes. This character is very, I could do it in like I'm writing a book, right? But that's not what you want to do for session notes. You just want those 5 words, and in that you can glance at that really quick and you have the information you need. So I guess, one piece of advice is when you're making your session notes, don't write paragraphs, don't write complete sentences, write words, phrases, bullet points, and keep it as succinct as possible. Like, everything you write, think, how can I say this in as few words as possible? Like the word the, you never need the word the, you never need the word a or and, right? Yeah, so just really condense it down to just those words that you need. So Sophia goes on to say, how would you do this for your own adventures and how would you do it for published adventures? Do you transcribe the adventure in a short format, or do you make notes in the adventure itself? If you're using a published adventure, I would write in the freaking adventure. I mean, you bought the book. It's not like you got it from a library and you have to return it, right? It's your book. So, underline things, highlight things, write notes in the margins, whatever you need to do that's going to make that easier to navigate. And yeah, if it's really bad, like a Star Wars adventure for Fantasy Flight's game Star Wars, you might be better off taking that and writing your own notes. But let's think about this for a second. You're basically rewriting the adventure, right? This is why I say published adventures are not as great as a lot of us may think they are, and you're going to end up spending as much or even more time preparing for a published adventure as you will just coming up with something yourself. Especially if you have to take this long, wordy, too full of itself adventure and write your own notes from that so that you have something you can actually use at the table. So yeah, as far as published adventures, I'd say definitely don't be afraid to write in a book. Even if you're going to sell the thing on eBay or whatever, you're not going to get that much money for it anyway. If you're really concerned about reselling the thing, write in pencil and then go through and erase it all when you're done with the adventure. But yeah, I definitely take notes, underline, highlight, whatever's going to help you. As far as your own adventures, let me see if I can think of anything else. This is something I struggle with myself. My session notes are different almost every time. And honestly, I haven't done the template thing, so I don't even take my own advice. Because I'm not going to do it. It's just not my style. First of all, that seems like too much like front end work and time to like make this template and try to maintain it. And I'm just kind of all over the place when I'm planning adventures. Some of it's handwritten stuff. Some of it's in, maybe a Word document. Some of it's maybe in OneNote. It's kind of, wherever I am, wherever I happen to be when I have time to do something, I just do it. So to take all that and try to put it into a template in one document, it would just eat up a bunch of time. And just for me in my process, it doesn't work. But I think it could work for people that do things that way. So, take it. If it works for you, try it. But yeah, I guess really my best advice is just keep things as short and succinct as possible. And definitely, pay attention during a session to anything that you prepared that you ended up not needing. And I don't mean not needing like they just didn't get to that point yet. Although maybe you're over prepared, like maybe you're preparing 2 sessions worth for 1 session and you don't need to do so much, right? But maybe it's just things like you're writing out descriptions for the NPCs and you never use them because you remember them, right? And for me, there's a thing where when I write something down, I tend to remember it. So like when I was in school, I would take copious notes. And in fact, in college, whenever, we were having finals and someone like missed a day and they're trying to get notes from someone, like people would always come and get my notes because I would practically write down everything the professor said. I would just write down everything. And so, my notes were very extensive. But the thing was when I studied for exams, I found that I didn't have to study my notes very much because just the process of writing them down like kind of cemented it in my mind. So I think that's true for a lot of people. So if you're like that, maybe one thing that you can do is kind of have 2 sets of notes. One set of notes that you're just writing for yourself to kind of get it in your brain, but you're not going to actually use during the session because you're writing sentences and it's all this information you're not going to need. And then a more succinct like bullet points or an outline or whatever. Outlines are another great way to do notes that you use during the actual session. And another piece of advice that might help here that I've heard said before and I think is really good advice is when you're preparing for a session, go broad, don't go deep. And what that means is, let's say you're doing like kind of a sandboxy thing. Let's say the PCs are in a city and you're planning for the adventure that they're just going to be doing things in the city, right? So a good way to prepare for that is to go broad. So come up with a bunch of different places in the city that they could go. Like there's an opera over here, and there's a weapon shop over here, and there's an armorer over here, and there's a general store over here, and there's a temple to this god here and a temple to that god there, and come up with a lot of places that the PCs could go and things that they could do, NPCs they could interact with, but don't really flesh out any of that a whole lot because you don't know which of those things the PCs are going to do. And chances are really good that some of those places, they're never, ever going to go. So if you spend all this time fleshing out this temple and everything about this temple, and the PCs never go there, you just wasted all that time. That time just went down the toilet, right? So you're better off just coming up with the place and not having anything and coming up with, if they go to the temple, then coming up with it on the fly, or better yet, having your players help you come up with details, which I talked some about, having the players help with world building and stuff in the last episode. And that's definitely a great way to go, is have the players suggest what's in the temple, what kind of decorations are there, how are the priests dressed, things like that, if you don't already know. Or at most, just jot down, like I said, like a few words. or at most a sentence or two, and not an Edgar Allan Poe sentence. It's really a paragraph disguised as a sentence, like just a short sentence or two about each thing. So that's the whole go broad, don't go deep. And then that way, if they'd never go to the temple, well, the only time you wasted was however long it took to come up with those few words or those couple sentences, which is a lot less time than writing a magnum opus on the temple that they're never going to see. So yeah, I guess I've said everything I can think of to say about that. This is a great thing. If you have an idea for Sophia and other GMs like her of how to do your session notes so that they're easily available during play, like she says, and it's not too much information to actually be useful to you, that I haven't mentioned, shoot me an email, gamemastersjourney@gmail.com, and I'll mention that in the next GM 101, because I feel like there's some really obvious stuff that I'm just not thinking of right now. And even if it's not super obvious stuff, I'm sure there's other strategies that people have that can be useful. Okay, so next Sophia asks, how do you make sure that you don't stick too much to a published adventure and avoid railroading? Yeah, this is a rough one. Unfortunately, part of it's just the adventure. How good is the adventure? If it's a really railroady adventure, it's going to be a lot harder not to be a railroady GM if you're going to do the adventure, right? I guess my best piece of advice is a smart-ass response, which would be don't run published adventures. But that's not very helpful, right? Because you've got this adventure you want to run and you're wanting to know how can I not be so railroady with it. I guess the next best piece of advice I could give, which may not be the answer you're looking for, is be prepared to throw the adventure away at any moment. Don't be committed or married to the idea of this adventure is going to end anything like the adventure says it will, or even that we're going to do the adventure. If your PCs take a left turn at some point, be ready to just go with that and say, forget the adventure, which is another reason I recommend not doing published adventures, because then you just waste that money. Or I should say published campaigns. Adventures, if they're short, can be okay. And at least then you can kind of peruse the adventure before you buy it and know whether it's going to be railroady or whether it's going to be worth it to do or whatnot, where it's hard to do that with a campaign, unless you're going to go to like Barnes & Noble and read the whole book in the cafe or something. Yeah, I mean, honestly, if you're running an adventure that's at all railroady, I think the only way you can really avoid railroading the players is to be willing to go off script and be ready for the possibility that you may not even finish the adventure. You may go sideways at some point, and being okay with that. But as far as like if you're trying to run this plotted railroady adventure, like how to pull that off without being railroady, there are techniques you can use to hide the rails so they're not so visible, so maybe the players won't realize that they're being railroaded when they are. So some of these include like the whole thing of you have 3 doors to choose from, and it doesn't matter which door the players choose, the same thing is behind, the thing they need to find is behind whichever door they happen to choose. Personally, I think that's really cheap and lame. But it can work as long as your players never figure out what you're doing. If they do, you could have a mutiny on your hands. But obviously that's not going to work if you're doing like a dungeon crawl and you have a map, because then it's on paper what's there, and they'll know if you're changing things around. But that can work, and that's kind of a metaphor, right? It's not necessarily 3 doors, but they have, like if they're doing the murder investigation, they have 3 clues they could pursue, and all 3 clues are going to end to the same point or whatever. But I think that's kind of lame. I mean, if you have to do that to make a published adventure work, then it's better than just obviously railroading them. But I would, as soon as possible, get to the point where you can run your own stuff and you can design stuff that isn't so railroady, so the players can actually have real choices and you can adapt to those choices instead of just shoehorning whatever they do into what you wanted to happen anyway. Because that's not really choice or agency at all. It's a facade. The other possibility is trying to find publish adventures that are not as scripted or not as railroady, but it's hard to find good. I've yet to see a good sandbox adventure. I'm not saying they're not out there. I've just not seen one. So yeah. Wow, I don't feel like I'm helping you a whole lot, Sophia, with your questions today. So if you're listening and you have ideas for Sophia about how to run a published adventure and avoid it seeming railroady to the players when it is, let me know. GameMastersJourney@gmail.com. How can you make combat fast and interesting and avoid making it a mini game where people stop role-playing and revert to dice rolling? And yeah, that's a good one. I think I covered that a little bit last episode with the whole speeding up or slowing down combat. But the first thing is do all the things during combat that you do outside of combat, right? So part of it is actually on the shoulders of the GM, because a lot of times as GMs, we change when we go into combat. It's not just the players, it's us, how we're presenting the combat. You know, we go from being very descriptive and characterizing people and things to he attacks, he hits, you take 5 damage, next player's turn, you know? So, you know, my first piece of advice is, as a GM, do all the things that you normally do outside of combat in combat. Find ways to do those. Be descriptive about the combat. Be descriptive about where it's happening, what's in the environment. Be descriptive about the characters or monsters that the PCs are facing off against. Be descriptive about the things that the characters are doing. You know, so instead of the orc swings his sword, you know, the orc swings his sword downward in a mighty blow, scraping across your breastplate or something like that, you know. And something that I've found myself is I worry a lot about pacing as a GM, and I try to keep things moving. And I have the benefit of the fact that I run my games, or most of my games, online, and they're streamed and then put on YouTube. So I get to, when I'm editing the video later, I get to watch myself GM the entire session. And so I get to see what I'm doing, and I see myself doing things that I'm like, oh my God, I didn't realize I was doing that. That's terrible, you know? So I've said before, you know, a great way to grow as a GM is if you can record yourself in some way and watch yourself. You can learn a lot that way, and you'll see things that you're doing that you really like that maybe you didn't realize were that cool while you were doing them, or you didn't even realize you did it. And you'll also see things that you did that you didn't like that maybe you didn't realize, or you didn't realize how annoying it was until you were watching it. So something I noticed is I'm trying, and you know, I've had like 5 or 6 players in my group online, which is really unwieldy, period, and especially unwieldy online. And so I was very conscious of how long each turn was taking. And so I would try to keep things moving so the players wouldn't get bored waiting for their turn. And I actually was going too far. And it was a combination of, I was encouraging the players to keep their turns short. So the players were doing less and less of their own descriptions during combat. That it was coming down to, I attack, here's my damage, move on. And I was doing the same thing with the NPCs. So I recently, and I talked to my players about it too, made the decision of, I'm not going to do that anymore. You know, I'm going to consciously slow down in combat as far as trying to be more descriptive and not worrying about how long is this taking, and focusing on making it cinematic and as vivid as possible. And I told the players, I'm like, hey, you know I've been encouraging you guys to kind of keep things short and snappy during combat. And, you know, you guys have done a great job of doing that, but I feel like now we've gone too far the other way. And, you know, so I'm encouraging you, you know, still do things like pay attention, be ready for your turn. All that stuff still applies, but don't hold back from being descriptive. If you want to describe in vivid detail exactly what you're doing, do that, because it makes it more fun for us. And, you know, we're streaming and it's on YouTube. It makes it better for the viewer too. So yeah, try to make your combats as cinematic as you can. Try to describe the NPCs, the environment, what the NPCs are doing. And, one thing that's helpful is when you're watching like a movie or a TV show that has a really good action sequence, is kind of think about if that were happening in an RPG that you were running, like how you could present that, how you could describe the dynamics that are happening and bring that out. And, finally encourage your players to do all this too, to be descriptive and as cinematic as possible. And, going back to the earlier discussion about the like fate points and GM intrusions and stuff, I completely forgot to talk about inspiration in D&D, which I actually much prefer over fate points or GM intrusions, because inspiration has nothing to do with XP, has nothing to do with character advancement, has nothing to do with anything other than once in a while you can get a bonus on a roll. You can roll with advantage, which is, if you're going to have a mechanic like that, that's the way it should be, right? Because that way it's like, well, if I forget to give a player inspiration during a session, I mean, yeah, they didn't have inspiration. They didn't get that bonus on one roll, but it doesn't really matter in the long term, right? Where if that's part of their XP that they need to build their character and I'm consistently not doing it, then that does matter, right? So this is another great thing about inspiration is, you can not only use it as described in the player's handbook where you're giving it for playing their character flaws, but you can also use it to encourage behavior that you want to see more of from your players. And the same thing with fate points or handing out XP in like Numenera. So if you see a player do something really cinematic in combat, and maybe even it's not the most tactically, beneficial thing to do, but they do something because they think it's cool or it's funny or it's heroic or whatever, give them XP for that, or inspiration, or a fate point, or whatever your game uses. Give them an immediate reward so that player's like, hey, I got this reward for doing this cool thing, I'm going to do it more. And the other players are like, hey, that player just got that cool thing, I'm going to do that, right? So anything you can do to encourage and reward anything that your players are doing during combat that's making it more fun, more cinematic, and more interesting. And my last idea, which this is something I've done before in like Changeling. I don't think I ever did it in Vampire, but I did in Changeling, and this is like literally decades ago. I haven't done it recently, but it can be kind of fun. Is, if you really are having an issue with your group where it is turning into a mini game when you do combat, and this was the main thing that turned me off of Pathfinder, because that's how it always was with Pathfinder. Like every Pathfinder game I ever played, it didn't matter which side of the table I was on or where it was or who it was, every single time I ever played Pathfinder, that's the way it was. Combat, we're playing a different game now. It's a mini game. We're playing this tactical board game, and we're not role playing anymore. So if you're in a situation where that's happening, one possible way to just kind of recalibrate everybody's expectations is do a combat without dice at all. And say, all right, for this combat, we're not rolling any dice. And your success or failure, or how well you do each turn with what you say you're going to do, is going to be completely based on how well and how cool you describe. Wow, that doesn't make sense. How well you describe what you're doing and how cool it is, right? So if you're like, I attack the orc, then, well, you just missed, because that was lame and uninspired. But if you're like, I do a roll between the orc's legs and come up behind him and I stick my dagger in his left butt cheek, you hit and you crit, because that was cool, right? And do a whole combat like that, or do a few combats like that. And just to get the players into this mode of, oh, let's focus more on describing what we do and less on worrying about what am I going to roll, what's my bonus, what's my damage, and that kind of stuff. But I think if you just do a few combats like that, it might kind of recalibrate everybody's thinking, and then you can bring the dice back in and people will still do the more creative stuff. Oh, and one other thing, and this kind of ties into the pacing discussion. with combat specifically is depending on the game you play. Well, I guess most games have some kind of initiative system, right? And I have found personally, I think initiative is a big culprit in this. I think part of the problem is depending on your system, initiative can take too long. Like for instance, Star Wars, the RPG, I think their initiative system is cool. It's a cool idea, but it takes way too long. Like rolling initiative and figuring out everybody's initiative, it takes way too long. So that kind of creates a disconnect because whatever pacing momentum you had has just been destroyed by the whole initiative process. And it kind of signifies that shift from one game to another. It's almost like this trigger, like this Pavlovian trigger, where when I say roll initiative, everybody's brain shifts from the RPG to the tactical game. And I've seen it happen so many times. So one way that you can kind of sidestep that is to find a way to avoid starting a combat with an initiative roll. And there are different ways you can do that. One way is to have the players roll initiative at the beginning of the session. And this is something I might actually try myself, is at the beginning of the session, have the players roll initiative first thing and record that somewhere, right? And you roll initiative for whatever the first encounter is going to be at that time as well. So you have that set up, you got the turn order ready. Then when the first combat comes, boom, you've already got your initiative. You don't have to say roll initiative. You can just move fluidly into the combat, and hopefully there's not that break of, oh, now we're going into combat game because we rolled initiative, right? And then when that combat is over, then have the PCs roll initiative again for the next combat. And then at that point, if you're going to do that, I would just roll initiative for all the NPCs and all the creatures that you're going to need before the game even starts. Like have those numbers somewhere already done. And then, after the first combat, PCs roll initiative and you make your little list or whatever with the NPCs for the next combat, or maybe you have to wait because you don't know what's going to come next. And then when you're like, okay, they're going to fight this thing next, then you can make your little list because you got your NPC numbers already generated. You got your PC numbers already generated. And I think that can work. And I think I'm going to try that with at least one of my D&D games and see if it works and see if it really makes a difference. I think it will, because I think that roll for initiative, those words, it's like a trigger. And it's just like the dog hearing the bell and it starts salivating. Your players hear that and their mind shifts into this other mode. So yeah, try that. And if you try that, let me know how it works. I'd love to hear from people who try that, if they noticed a difference or if it worked or not. All right, so that's, man, this went long again. That's, I finally got through the feedback that I have so far. Of course, I just released the second GM 101, which was episode 69, or no, episode 70. So hopefully I'll get lots of feedback in comments from that one. Hopefully I don't get into combat. Hopefully no one comes after me with a medieval sword because it's something I said in episode 70. But I would love to hear from you about the GM 101. If you're a new GM or anybody, I don't give a fuck. Whoever you are, if you have a question about game mastering or you have a topic you'd like me to discuss that has to do with being a game master, let me know. Shoot me an email at gamemastersjourney@gmail.com. Let me know. If you're someone who has already asked a question that I've talked about and you have a follow-up question or a clarification or anything like that, let me know. And yeah, I really enjoy getting questions from you and kind of letting you direct, what shape this discussion takes and what topics we focus on, because you know better than I do what you need, right? So yeah, let me know. I'd love to hear from you. So that is going to wrap up episode 71 of Game Master's Journey and our third GM 101 episode. I'll be making another one of these GM 101 episodes pretty soon. Also, I have another world building episode in the works. I've got some interviews in the works. So lots of good stuff coming up. So stay subscribed, stay tuned in, keep listening. If you'd like to reach me, please email me at gamemastersjourney@gmail.com. You can also follow me on Google+, just search for Lex Starwalker. And you can follow me on Twitter at Lex Starwalker. Please visit my website, starwalkerstudios.com. You can find all my podcasts there. You can find the show notes for this podcast. I'll have some links to help you out. You can also find a big red Google+ button to subscribe or join the Google+ community for Game Master's Journey. And that's a great place to connect with other GMs and other players. And it's a great place to ask questions about GMing. And then you can get not only my opinion, but everybody else's too. We have over 600 members now. So there are a lot of people viewing that, and you can get a lot of input to stuff. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for your support. Thanks again, Steve, my executive producer, for your support, sir. Thank you to all the patrons. Thank you to everyone who's donated. Thank you to everyone who's left reviews. I really, really appreciate it. So I hope that you have a chance to play your favorite RPG this week. And, you know, if you're considering becoming a GM, I hope that you just go for it. Just go for it. Find some friends that you trust, that you can game with, you know, that are going to be easy on you, and just do it. If you just run a session, you know, even if it sucks, you got that first session out of the way, and the next one's going to be a lot easier, and you're going to have a lot more fun with it. And, you know, it's like in writing, they say, you know, your first book is allowed to suck. You know, if you're a new GM, your first session, hell, your first campaign is allowed to suck. But you know what? It probably won't. Because I'll tell you a secret about being a GM. You will almost always be your worst critic. You are going to be way harder on yourself than any of your players are going to be. And a lot of the mistakes that you make, or the things that you do that you don't like, a lot of times the players aren't even going to notice, or they're not going to care. Which is not to say that you shouldn't, you know, pay attention to that stuff and try to get better. I mean, that's what this show's all about. But don't let that stop you. Don't let fear of not doing well enough or not being good at it, don't let that stop you, because you'll probably do a lot better than you think, and your players are going to have fun. You're going to have fun. Just, you know, don't worry about shit. Don't worry about the rules. Don't worry about the mechanics. Worry about, well, don't worry, but let your primary focus be on, let's all have a good time. Let's have fun, you know? And if you do that, you'll all have fun, and it'll be a success. And it won't matter if you screwed up combat, or if you screwed up some rule somewhere or whatever, because everybody had a good time. No one's going to care. And there's always the next session where you can say, hey, you know that really broken thing I did? Yeah, it was broken. We're not doing that anymore. You know, you can always retcon or change things. And, you know, especially if your players know that you're a new GM, you know, they're not going to care. All right. I got on a huge tangent in the middle of my sign off. What am I doing here? So I'll be back soon next week. I'll be back soon, maybe next week, maybe sooner. Who knows? With another episode of Game Master's Journey. Until then, game on, Game Master. You are the Game Master.
This has been a Starwalker Studios production, your source for quality gaming and hobby podcasts.
This episode's music provided by Cloudwalker, Renfield, Transboy, and Ish. Please see the show notes for more details at starwalkerstudios.com/GameMastersJourney.